Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e6. Pawn d2 to d4. Pawn d7 to d5. Knight b1 to d2. Knight g8 to f6. Pawn e4 to e5. Knight f6 to d7. Bishop f1 to d3. Pawn c7 to c5. Pawn c2 to c3. Knight b8 to c6. Knight g1 to e2. Pawn c5 takes d4. Pawn c3 takes d4. Knight d7 to b6. Castle kingside. Bishop f8 to e7. Knight d2 to f3. Castle kingside. Bishop c1 to f4. Bishop c8 to d7. Knight e2 to c3. Knight b6 to c4. Queen d1 to e2. Knight c4 to b6. Rook a1 to c1. Rook a8 to c8. Rook f1 to d1. Knight c6 to b4. Bishop d3 to b5. Knight b6 to c4. Bishop b5 takes d7. Queen d8 takes d7. Bishop f4 to g5. Knight b4 to c6. Knight c3 to e4. Pawn d5 takes e4. Bishop g5 takes e7. Queen d7 takes e7. Rook c1 takes e4. Pawn e4 takes f3. Queen e2 takes f3. Queen e7 to h4. Queen f3 to b3. Rook f8 to d8. Pawn d4 to d5. Queen h4 to h5. Rook c4 takes c6. Pawn b7 takes c6. Queen b3 to f3. Queen h5 takes f3. Pawn g2 takes f3. Pawn c6 takes d5. King g1 to g2. Rook c8 to c2. Rook d1 to b1. Rook d8 to b8. Pawn f3 to f4. Pawn d5 to d4. Rook b1 to d1. Rook b8 to b4. Rook d1 to b1. Pawn d4 to d3. King g2 to f3. Pawn d3 to d2. Pawn h2 to h4. Rook c2 to c1. Pawn f4 to f5. Rook c1 takes b1. Pawn a2 to a3. Pawn d2 to d1, promoting to queen, check. King f3 to e3. Queen d1 to e1, check. King e3 to d3. Rook b4 takes h4. Pawn f5 takes e6. Rook b1 to d1, check. King d3 to c2. Pawn h7 to h5. Pawn e6 to e7. Rook h4 to c4, check. King c2 to b3. Rook c4 to c3, check. Pawn b2 takes c3. Rook d1 to b1, check. King b3 to c4. Queen e1 to e4, check. King c4 to c5. Rook b1 to b5, check. King c5 takes b5. Queen e4 to d5, check. King b5 to b4. Pawn a7 to a5, check. King b4 to a4. Queen d5 to d7, check. King a4 takes a5. Queen d7 takes e7. Pawn c3 to c4. Queen e7 to c5, check. King a5 to a4. Queen c5 takes f2. King a4 to b3. Pawn g7 to g5. King b3 to c3. Queen f2 to e3, check. King c3 to c2. Pawn h5 to h4. King c2 to d1. Pawn h4 to h3. Pawn c4 to c5. Pawn g5 to g4. Pawn c5 to c6. Pawn g4 to g3. Pawn c6 to c7. Queen e3 to d3, check. King d1 to e1. Queen d3 to b1, check. King e1 to d2. Queen b1 to a2, check. King d2 to c3. Queen a2 takes a3, check. King c3 to d4. Queen a3 to a7, check. King d4 to e4. Queen a7 to b7, check. King e4 to f4. Pawn g3 to g2. King f4 to e3. Pawn g2 to g1, promoting to queen, check. King e3 to f4. Queen g1 to f2, check. King f4 to g4. Queen f2 to f3, check. King g4 to h4. Queen b7 to e4, check. King h4 to g5. Queen e4 to f4, checkmate.